I want to welcome you to the IMF Summer School Preview for the LIC DSFx. This course was jointly developed by the IMF and the World Bank and funded by the Debt Management Facility. Its goal is to teach you about the Debt Sustainability Framework for Low-Income Countries, or LIC DSF, created to help low-income countries achieve their development goals while minimizing the risk of debt distress. And now you can gain an understanding on how the LIC DSF works, starting with Lesson 1, an overview of the LIC DSF. In Lesson 2, you will learn about the LIC DSF Realism tool that analyzes past contributors to unexpected changes in the debt-to-GDP ratio. The third lesson discusses the role of stress test scenarios. Lesson 4 presents the variables considered when calculating a country's debt carrying capacity. And the fifth and final lesson explains how risk signals combine into risk ratings. Register for the full LIC DSFx course for free at the link below. I hope you decide to join us.
The LIC DSF is a joint World Bank and International Monetary Fund framework used to assess debt vulnerabilities and conduct standardized debt sustainability analysis. The objective of the LIC DSF is to support efforts by low-income countries to achieve their development goals while minimizing risk of debt distress. To that end, the LIC DSF produces projections of debt burden indicators under a baseline scenario and under stress test scenarios. A baseline scenario is the most likely scenario given up-to-date data and policies that are either already in place or announced and likely to be implemented. On the other hand, stress tests are scenarios in which baseline projections are affected by an adverse shock. The LIC DSF also presents tools to assess the realism of the underlying assumptions. As an example, the framework will assess the consistency between the projections of fiscal adjustment and GDP growth. In general, a stronger fiscal adjustment is associated with lower GDP growth. This implies that if the LIC DSF were to assume a given fiscal adjustment path without acknowledging its negative short-term implications for GDP growth, the risk of debt distress would likely be underestimated. The quality of a debt sustainability analysis is only as good as the quality of its underlying assumptions. For each debt burden indicator, the LIC DSF produces a threshold above which the indicator signals risk of debt distress. These thresholds depend on the country's ability to handle debt, which is determined by a debt carrying capacity indicator produced by the LIC DSF. Using projected debt burden indicators and their corresponding thresholds, the LIC DSF produces mechanical risk signals that depend on whether the indicators breach their thresholds.
The value of the LIC DSF as an early warning tool for debt distress depends on the quality of underlying projections. This realism tool asks what factors contributed to unexpected increases in debt to GDP ratio in the past, and what is assumed about these factors' contribution to debt in the future. The figure shows an example of the presentation of this tool in the LIC DSF. You can find this figure in the worksheet called Output 4.1 Forecast Error. The left panel in the figure displays the debt-creating flows that account for the change in debt both in the last 5 years, shown in the figure as historical change, and in the first 5 years of projection, shown in the figure as projected change. 5 public debt-creating flows are presented in the figure. These are the primary fiscal deficit, real GDP growth, the real exchange rate depreciation, other debt-creating flows, and the residual. When there are significant discrepancies between the past and the projected debt-creating flows, these discrepancies should be understood and justified. In this example for country X, we observe 4 large differences between the historical pattern of debt accumulation and projections for debt. First, the projected contribution of primary deficits is smaller than its historical contributions to debt. In the past 5 years, primary deficit was the largest contributor to raising debt. However, projected fiscal position will help reduce debt in the coming 5 years. This difference could be due to either some one-off negative shocks in the past that have now abated, or a substantial planned fiscal adjustment incorporated in the projections. Second, real exchange rate depreciation had made a large contribution to debt accumulation in the past. However, there is a negligible projected change in the real exchange rate. Such a different contribution in the future can be justified if the equilibrium real exchange rate gap has already closed. Third, the projected contribution of real GDP growth to limiting debt accumulation is larger than the historical contribution. In other words, projected real GDP growth is higher than the past growth. Lastly, a large part of past debt accumulation was determined by a residual, suggesting unidentified debt-creating factors were at play. It is important to understand this residual and whether same factors may continue to be relevant in the future and thus should be added into the debt projections. Let's now turn to forecast errors in the past debt projections. As you can see in the right panel of the figure, the LIC DSF decomposes the forecast errors in debt accumulation over the past 5 years and compare these errors with the forecast errors in other low-income countries. This figure presents 2 key points. First, it shows which factors have contributed the most to unexpected changes in debt. In this example, the primary fiscal deficit, the real exchange rate depreciation, and the residual contributed the most to debt forecast errors. These factors thus deserve a careful examination for the projection period. Second, this figure shows how debt forecast errors for country X are compared to its peer group of other low-income countries. In this case, the forecast error for country X, as shown by the diamond, is a clear outlier because it is well above the distribution of forecast error in other low-income countries.
The baseline scenario should represent the most realistic macroeconomic and debt portfolio assumptions based on the most up-to-date and best available knowledge. However, informed and prudent borrowing decisions require an assessment of the debt profile under alternative assumptions. For example, if the real GDP growth is lower than expected, will it endanger debt sustainability? The LIC DSF produces mechanical risk ratings based on whether debt burden indicators exceed the corresponding thresholds under either the baseline or stress test scenarios. Also note that stress testing reveals the country's vulnerabilities. For example, in the figure, the baseline scenario does not show a breach of the debt burden threshold over the projection period. However, there is a stress test scenario in which a significant rise in debt burden indicator results in a breach of its threshold. Such breaches of thresholds under stress tests reveal debt vulnerabilities to shocks and affect the risk rating. In the LIC DSF, there are 3 types of stress tests. First, standardized stress tests, which apply to all countries, for example, a GDP growth shock. Second, tailored stress tests, which apply to countries exposed to specific risks, for example, natural disasters. The exception is the contingent liability stress test, which has a basic component that applies to all countries and tailored components that depend on a country-specific conditions. And finally, customized scenarios which apply to a specific country to capture idiosyncratic risks, for example, a civil war or an epidemic.
Why does debt carrying capacity vary across countries? Countries with different institutional and policy strengths, macroeconomic performance, and levels of buffers to absorb shocks have different abilities to sustain debt without significant debt distress risks. In the LIC DSF, institutional strength is measured by the World Bank's Country Policy and Institutional Assessment Rating, or in short, the CPIA rating. In the 2017 review of the LIC DSF, it was recognized that on top of the CPIA rating, additional factors that affect a country's capacity to handle debt burden should be included in assessing debt carrying capacity. 3 additional factors were added as determinants of the debt carrying capacity. The first factor is the global economic environment, which is represented by world GDP growth. The second factor is the country's income, which is represented by GDP growth and remittances. And the third factor is countries' buffers to absorb shocks, which is represented by international reserves. The LIC DSF produces mechanical signals for the risk of debt distress by comparing projected values of each debt burden indicator under the baseline and stress test scenarios against the corresponding thresholds. These mechanical signals are drawn from data for the first 11 years of the projection period. Among the many stress test scenarios that can influence mechanical signals, the LIC DSF picks signals from the most extreme shock, which is defined for each debt burden indicator as the shock that produces the highest value of that indicator in any of the first 11 years. Mechanical signals can be easily identified through charts. For each debt burden indicator, we may observe one of the 3 possibilities. In first case, the projected values of the debt burden indicator do not breach the corresponding threshold under the baseline or under the most extreme shock scenario. This no breach case suggests that, according to this debt indicator, future debt distress risk is not significant. In second case, projected values for the debt burden indicator do not breach the corresponding threshold in the baseline scenario, but they breach the threshold for the most extreme shock scenario. In this case, this debt burden indicator signals some risk of future debt distress. In third case, projected values of the debt burden indicator breach the corresponding debt threshold in the baseline scenario, which automatically implies that a breach also occurred under the most extreme shock scenario. This situation reveals higher risk of debt distress than either of the previous 2 cases. Then, these signals from all relevant debt burden indicators are combined to produce the mechanical risk rating. There are 3 main categories for the risk of debt distress. First, low risk of debt distress if none of the relevant debt burden indicators breaches the respective threshold, neither in the baseline nor in the most extreme shock scenario. Second, moderate risk of debt distress if none of the relevant debt burden indicators breaches the respective threshold in the baseline scenario, but at least one threshold is breached for the most extreme shock scenario. And third, high risk of debt distress if at least one debt burden indicator breaches the corresponding threshold in the baseline scenario, which automatically implies the threshold is also breached for the most extreme shock scenario. It is important to note that short-lived breaches, like breaches of 1 year of the threshold are automatically disregarded in calculating the mechanical risk rating.